There is exactly one factory ship left on Earth that still operates the way they used to in the middle of the 20th century. Not one of the largest, not one of the most advanced. The last one. And right now, somewhere in the freezing waters of the North Pacific, it is fully operational with a crew of several hundred people who are about to spend the next 8 months at sea without ever touching land. The ship is called the Nisshin Maru. It is Japanese, it is 130 meters long, and it was built for a purpose that most of the world has spent the last few decades trying to stop. To understand what actually happens on that ship every single day, you have to understand why it exists at all, and why, despite decades of international pressure, it keeps going out. Japan has been fishing whales commercially since the 1600s. By the mid-20th century, the industry had grown into something enormous. Factory ships were the backbone of it, vessels that could catch, process, and freeze entire whales at sea without ever returning to port. At the peak, Japan was sending entire fleets of them, but the global whale population was collapsing under the weight of it. And in 1986, the International Whaling Commission imposed a moratorium on commercial whaling. Most countries stopped. Japan did not exactly. Instead, they continued under a scientific research exemption. They would harvest whales, they said, to study them. The meat from those whales would then be sold domestically, because Japanese law requires that byproducts from research programs not go to waste. Critics called it commercial whaling with extra paperwork. Japan maintained it was science. That argument went back and forth for over 30 years. In 2019, Japan formally withdrew from the International Whaling Commission and resumed commercial whaling in its own coastal waters. But the Nisshin Maru still operates separately, still working under the research banner in Antarctic waters, still doing what it has done for decades. So what does a day on that ship actually look like? The crew wakes up in shifts, because the ship does not stop. Processing happens around the clock when there are whales to process, which means the concept of a normal workday does not really apply here. The vessel has multiple decks dedicated to different stages of what happens after a whale is caught, and the workers move between them in rotating rotations. The catching itself is done by smaller catcher vessels that travel alongside the Nisshin Maru. They use harpoon cannons, and once a whale is secured, it is transferred to the factory ship through a slipway cut into the stern, a massive opening at the back of the vessel that allows entire whales to be hauled aboard. At this point, the processing crew takes over. A single minke whale, the most common species they catch, weighs somewhere between 5 and 10 tons. Processing one from start to finish takes roughly an hour with a full crew working. The deck is cold. The hours are long. The conditions are what you would expect from a steel ship in Antarctic waters, which is to say brutal in ways that are hard to fully communicate from land. Wind chill temperatures routinely drop well below zero. The ship pitches and rolls in seas that the Southern Ocean is famous for generating. Workers are on these voyages for months. They sleep in small shared quarters. They eat in a communal galley. They communicate with family back home through whatever satellite connection the ship maintains, which is limited. There are no days off in the traditional sense. When there is work, the work happens. When there are no whales to process, the crew does maintenance, cleaning, equipment checks, the unglamorous infrastructure work that keeps any large vessel operational. The psychological dimension of this kind of work is something that rarely gets discussed. 8 months is a long time to be at sea. Some of the crew have done multiple voyages and describe an adaptation that sounds almost like a separate relationship with time, where the rhythms of the ship replace the rhythms of ordinary life so completely that coming home at the end of a season feels genuinely disorienting. If you want to understand stories like this one, the kind that never make front pages but reveal how the world actually works beneath the surface, subscribe. We dig into this every week. The debate around the Nishin Maru is not just about whales, though that is obviously the loudest part of it. It is also about sovereignty, about whether international bodies have the right to dictate what individual nations eat or how they fish. Japan's position has always been that whaling is a cultural practice with centuries of history, and that the Western-led conservation movement applies its standards selectively, condemning whale hunting while accepting industrial livestock conditions that cause suffering at far greater scale. The counterargument is that whale populations, particularly the great whales, took such catastrophic damage during the 20th century that recovery requires sustained protection, and that a research exemption producing thousands of kilograms of commercially sold meat is not research in any meaningful sense. What is harder to argue with, regardless of where you stand on that debate, is that the people on the Nishin Maru are doing one of the most physically demanding jobs on the planet. The work is cold, repetitive, isolated, and not particularly well paid by the standards of the industry. The crew are not executives or policymakers. They are workers who signed up for a hard job on a ship and show up every day in conditions most people would last about 48 hours in. The fleet has been shrinking for years. The Nishin Maru is aging. Finding crew willing to commit to these voyages has reportedly become more difficult. The economics of Antarctic whaling have never fully recovered from the disruptions caused by the moratorium years and the ongoing pressure from environmental groups, some of which have physically intercepted the fleet at sea. Whether the Nishin Maru keeps operating for another decade or quietly stops sailing in the next few years, nobody knows for certain. What is clear is that there is something worth understanding in the fact that it is still out there right now, in water most people will never see, with a crew of people doing a job that almost no one else on Earth is doing anymore. That is not a defense of it. It is not a condemnation either. It is just the thing itself, which turns out to be stranger and more complicated than either version of the story you usually hear. There is another one on screen if you are not done yet.